So Bernie Sanders was recently asked about his view on the legitimacy of President Maduro in Venezuela. So I want to show you guys this video and then we'll talk about it. Let's take a look.
Good evening. In light of the recent events in Venezuela, you came out against U.S. intervention, a contentious stance as many in Venezuela are currently suffering at the hands of Maduro through starvation and violence, and it is clear that he will not let humanitarian aid in. Under these circumstances and moving forward, do you have a clear position on U.S. intervention overseas, both economically and militarily, for nations that are under the regimes of these oppressive dictators?
Thank you. Good question. There are a lot of awful things happening in the world, and what's going on in Venezuela is terrible. Their economy is a disaster. People are living in hunger and in fear. I strongly believe there has to be an international humanitarian effort to improve lives for the people. I think the evidence is pretty clear that the last election in Venezuela was not a free and fair election. And under international supervision, I want to see a free and fair election. But to answer your question, let me say this. I am old enough to remember the war in Vietnam. And I was as active as I could trying to keep the United States from going to war in Iraq. I was in the Congress at that point. And I am very fearful of the United States continuing to do what it has done in the past. As you know, or may know, the United States overthrew a democratically elected government in Chile and in Brazil and in Guatemala and in other countries around the world. So as someone who fervently believes in human rights and democracy, we have got to do everything that we can. But I think sometimes you have unintended consequences when a powerful nation goes in and tells people who their government will be. So my view is that whether it is Saudi Arabia, which is a despotic regime, or whether it is Venezuela, I think we have got to do everything that we can to create a democratic climate. But I do not believe in U.S. military intervention in those countries.
Why have you, Senator, why have you stopped short of calling Maduro of Venezuela a dictator?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the last election was undemocratic, but there are still democratic operations taking place in that country. The point is, what I am calling for right now is internationally supervised free elections. And I do find it interesting that Trump is very concerned about what goes on in Venezuela. But what about the last election that took place in Saudi Arabia? Oh, there wasn't any election in Saudi Arabia. Oh, women are treated as third-class citizens. So I find it interesting that Trump is kind of selective as to where he is concerned about democracy. My record is to be concerned about democracy all over the world. So we've got to do everything we can. But at the end of the day, it's going to be the people of Venezuela who determine the future of their country, not the United States of America.
As you know,
So overall, that was a decent answer. First off, let me emphasize that his major thesis is completely right on the nose correct. His overall thesis is basically that we should not engage ourselves with the military with any country when it comes to trying to enforce a democracy. We should rely on international programs that oversee democratic elections. And he actually mentioned some history. He talked about, for example, Vietnam. And I think he didn't mention Iraq. But with Vietnam, like that was one of the first wars that we got into where we were trying to basically instate our own dictatorships. That's when the U.S. Military intervention began to shift between trying to actually enforce a democracy to enforcing dictatorships. So keep in mind, guys, we support 73% of the world's dictatorships. Now, there are certain dictatorships that we don't support, and the ones that do tend to be like Russia, for example, or Turkey or something like that. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, right? They have right now the leader Bashar al-Assad. We did not put Bashar al-Assad in there. Russia did. That's a Russia-owned dictatorship. We do not support that dictatorship. We support other dictatorships. So when it comes to, for example, Saddam Hussein, when he was in power, we had originally supported him. We actually put him into power. And then we took him down. And this is kind of the cycles that we've been seeing with every single dictatorship. We put in our dictatorships, the people revolt, and we have like these quote-unquote terrorist groups, which to an extent they are. They're killing people for political reasons. That by definition is terrorism. But they revolt, and then they topple the government down, and we go in there and we try to basically settle the chaos, if you will. And by doing so, we put in our own dictatorship, and then we try to train people or whatever. We train a military, and we train a democracy and everything. We don't do that. We've never done that. There's never been a country that we've gone into and we've actually instated a democracy. Any country that we've ever gone into is still, in a sense, politically corrupt. And so Bernie Sanders is absolutely correct on this point. We should not be going in from a military perspective. We should be going in from an international global perspective as a team to oversee a democracy. But it's up to the people of every individual country to run their own elections, not us, not China, not Russia, not, we can't be the ones that are doing military intervention. That's not the strategy that we should be implementing. And so Bernie Sanders made a good point. We've gone into Chile, Brazil, Guatemala, and many other countries, and we actually toppled a democratically elected official and put in a dictatorship at some points. And so why do we do this, guys? A lot of people ask, like, why would we're supposed to be spreading democracy? What's going on? Well, when you implement a dictatorship, keep in mind that you now have control over that dictatorship. And so you get to control, for example, oil prices or exports to your country. So, for example, Saudi Arabia, we, in a sense, support that dictatorship. It's a dictatorship. There's never been an election, as Bernie Sanders says. And so how does that work? We give them military aid. They give us cheap oil. It's like a really nice kind of exchange going on here that we both benefit from, but the world absolutely hates, because when we give them military aid, guess where what they end up doing with that military aid? They sell it to terrorist organizations. And then you have places like, for example, Al-Qaeda that ends up with our weapons, ISIS that ends up with our weapons. There are so many terrorist groups that have ended up using U.S. manufactured weapons, and we wonder, oh, well, how did that happen? Well, it's so weird. Like, gosh, I don't know. That's strange, right? And it's like, no, it's not strange. We support their dictatorships. We end up giving them military aid, and then all of a sudden, those terrorist regimes have military support. And so it's a terrible cycle, and Bernie Sanders is absolutely right. But let me now criticize Bernie Sanders' response here. So we have to look at Venezuela for a second here. First off, we don't support the dictatorship of Venezuela, and he's absolutely right that Trump is focused on that dictatorship, and all the Republicans are focused on that dictatorship, but they'll never look at Saudi Arabia, where we fund tons of military aid. Could you imagine if we gave $110 billion worth of arms to Venezuela? That'd be crazy, right? Well, that's what we did with Saudi Arabia. It's the same concept, but it's just they're not Middle Eastern, I guess, which makes it probably even worse. So we have to understand that we don't support Venezuela. Venezuela has a dictator. His name is Maduro. I am surprised. First off, I was surprised that CNN asked the question, why is it that you haven't come out and said that Maduro was a dictatorship? I didn't see that, or dictator. I didn't see that question coming. But then I didn't see the response coming either. Bernie Sanders kind of gave this like, well, there's some aspects of democracy in Venezuela. Yeah, dude, no. It's a dictatorship. Like, yeah, you could say maybe at the point of Hugo Chavez, there were a lot of aspects that were democratic, but dude, like right now, it's a dictatorship. Like if you have a monarch that basically has rule over everything and they're not free and fairly elected, it's a dictatorship. And you could say all you want, well, they still have this, the Supreme Tribunal or whatever, and this National Council or Assembly or whatever. but yeah, they're all instated by Maduro. Like, the representation is absolutely messed up. The corruption in the government is absolutely messed up. The fact that people are getting slaughtered for trying to rise up against Maduro, to me, is messed up. So now, do I recognize President Guaido of Venezuela? No, not necessarily, because keep in mind, Guaido came in and he wanted, he basically said, I won the free and fair election. I want a free and fair election. And he's claiming that if he gets into power, that he'll start up this new vote or whatever. I strongly disagree with that. And let me explain why. Mike Pence has come out and said, yes, I support President Guaido. I recognize President Guaido. Donald Trump has said he recognized President Guaido. President Guaido is promising a free and fair election. How many of you guys would want to bet that President Guaido is actually going to want to host a genuine election when he has complete control and rule over Venezuela? Yeah, that's not going to happen, and we know it, and we absolutely know it. And here's the thing, guys. Venezuela has been framed as this absolutely terrible country, and so has Maduro. And keep in mind, there are so many aspects of Maduro that are terrible. I don't like him, but we've over-exaggerated how bad it is over there. And let me explain why. We keep saying things like, it is clear that Venezuela is not taking aid. That's not true. They are taking aid. They're not taking aid from us, and we've been doing PR stunts by like showing these bridges that are blockaded or whatever, and then it's saying, well, you know, they're preventing the U.S. from bringing in aid, but then you have Venezuela citizens who are saying, no, we're getting international aid. We're not getting U.S. aid, but we're getting international aid, and that's likely because those bridges, by the way, are never in use. If you notice, there were no cars there because they've never been used. They're like basically broken down, deserted bridges. And so it was an absolute PR stunt. And I don't like that this lady that was asking Bernie Sanders this question basically said, it is clear Venezuela is not taking aid. And you could see Bernie Sanders like nodding. I'm thinking to myself, like, dude, why are you agreeing with a false premise here? Like, that's an obvious false premise. Venezuela is taking aid, and you should emphasize that. The other thing is, like, call him a dictator. He's a dictator. Like, why do you have a problem with calling? To me, it seems like you're trying to dodge something when you don't need to. Like, just don't dodge the question. Just state, listen, he did not win a free and fair election. Done. We're done here. You call that you want to call that a dictator? If that's your definition of dictator, call him a dictator. If your definition of a dictator is completely take over the legislative branch, if you will, and then completely fill the Supreme Court equivalents with your own justices, if you want to call that a dictatorship, then call it a dictatorship. That's what I responded with. That's not what Bernie Sanders did. He said, oh, there's still some aspects of a democracy. Now you can debate him. Now you can start saying against Bernie Sanders, no, it's not a democracy. There's no democratic process involved. So I'm not sure why he dodged that. I want to hear you guys' opinions on why you guys think he dodged this question, why he just decided not to say that President Maduro is a dictator. So leave your comments below.